This is one of the tricky things about pregnenolone because most people will find pregnenolone relaxing due to its conversion to progesterone and allopregnenolone, which has tranquilizing-like effects. Oral is by far the most common application of pregnenolone, followed by troches or topical. Now, I prefer to work with oral. The reason why I prefer to work with oral is it's more accessible and there is more literature on oral pregnenolone. If pregnenolone can't be tested, a good way of indicating that it may be deficient is when both progesterone and DHEA are low. And if we come back to the steroidogenic cascade here, as you can see, DHEA and progesterone are both direct metabolites. So if someone has low pregnenolone symptoms and they have a deficiency of both the downstream metabolites, it is far from a slam dunk that they definitely have a pregnenolone deficiency, but it absolutely warrants a trial. Cortisol can also be elevated in a chronic stress state, irrespective of pregnenolone levels. And I do find that chronic stress, whether it's from physical pain, psychological circumstances, difficult chapters in life, poor metabolic health, I mean, the list goes on, these will absolutely mimic a pregnenolone deficiency. So it is very important to have someone look at this for you, outsource this diagnosis. Don't try to make it yourself. I will always recommend a trial of low-dose pregnenolone in the presence of optimal blood work if there are both symptoms and a probable root cause. So what do I mean by this? If someone has got severe pregnenolone deficiency and they've got a history of head trauma, even if the blood work comes back in optimal, I believe, due to how inaccurate the blood work can be, that in these circumstances, it is worth a trial of a low dose of pregnenolone, not a replacement dose, to see if it is beneficial and well tolerated. We're going to discuss dosing shortly. Pregnenolone can be taken 1 or 2 times a day by oral, topical, or sublingual troche. Most people, and this is one of the tricky things about pregnenolone, because I would say 60 to 70% being most, not 95 to 99%, most people will find pregnenolone relaxing due to its conversion to progesterone and allopregnenolone, which has tranquilizing-like effects. However, some people will find it stimulating and will prefer morning dosing. Personally, I recommend split dosing for anything greater than 50 milligrams per dose. The reason for this is that 25 to 50 milligrams in most studies tends to be the replenishment dose for a deficiency. And if someone does benefit from higher levels than this, I do recommend either splitting it up, or if it's taken once in the morning or once at night, it is taken via a sustained release micronized capsule. When we're looking at these symptoms of a deficiency, insomnia, anxiety, a stutter, unable to tolerate optimal doses of testosterone, brain fog, high sensitivity to stress, memory problems, low resilience, anhedonia, and potentially mild schizophrenic symptoms, it's very important that we start to turn the lens on what the pregnenolone levels are in the body. One thing that I have highlighted here, and I will highlight again today, is this inability to tolerate the optimal dose of testosterone. And I'll give an example. A gentleman will say, well, 150 milligrams of testosterone doesn't fix my negative symptoms, but 175 milligrams resolves my negative symptoms, but now they can't sleep and they're overstimulated. A lot of the time, these men will try to find this Goldilocks zone in between in this 25 milligram range. However, if people have a stark separation between symptom resolution and side effects with a small amount of testosterone, in my experience, this is more of an indicator that they need to be able to tolerate the optimal dose rather than find this middle Goldilocks zone when that higher optimal dose is well within physiological limits. Pregnenolone comes in a variety of forms. I believe it can be injected. I have never worked with injectable pregnenolone, and given that it is not bound to an ester when it's injected, I'm not going to be recommending that. Oral is by far the most common application of pregnenolone, followed by troches or topical. Now, I prefer to work with oral. The reason why I prefer to work with oral is it's more accessible and there is more literature on oral pregnenolone, and it is simply more accessible for the vast, vast majority of people, especially in pharmaceutical form. Sublingual pregnenolone and topical pregnenolone are arguably, at least mechanistically, advantageous due to increased presence of either the sulfatase enzyme via sublingual or 5-alpha reductase via topical. However, I have found that when someone actually receives proper hormone optimization, proper diet and lifestyle interventions, and uses a high-quality micronized oral pregnenolone supplement, that they are able to receive all the benefits and use a simple and effective version. Topical also creates more issues in terms of the base of the cream, as well as potentially transference, absorbency. That can be a lot of issues for this in terms of getting the dose dialed in. So I recommend sticking to pharmaceutical grade oral compounded pregnenolone. I prefer micronized. And since writing this lecture, originally, I have stated that micronized is a preference, but non-micronized is okay. I will repeat that. However, I will really strongly emphasize that micronized should be the preference, and only in extreme circumstances when that is not available, and I'm not talking about saving $10 a bottle, when micronized is absolutely not available, then non-micronized is okay. The reason why we want oral hormones to be micronized is they skip the first pass metabolism in the liver and are absorbed gradually in the gut. What will make this even better, however, is if the micronized hormone is in a sustained release matrix. This allows the half-life to be even more elongated, kind of like attaching a ester to an injectable form of testosterone, and this allows for stability and optimized levels 24/7. The most significant troubleshooting protocol for all hormone supplementation is to stabilize levels and increase dosing frequency. So being able to stabilize and optimize the metabolism of the hormone is a game changer in not only receiving the therapeutic benefits that we're looking to achieve, but also to avoid the potential side effects discussed previously. Now, if you're looking for a over-the-counter micronized product, the brands that I have found which make this are BioVia, Douglas Labs, and Pure Encapsulations. There are likely more that I am not aware of, but I strongly recommend getting it compounded from the pharmacy under prescription of a practitioner who knows how to work with pregnenolone. However, I do recognize that not everyone watching this will have access to a practitioner of the sort. So, dosing. When it comes to dosing, the oral micronized and sublingual dosing yields similar results in blood tests, milligram per milligram. And I have found that micronized, while it will result in a similar blood serum level, tends to result in better outcomes subjectively, as well as reduced side effects. In terms of starting with someone who has got an identified pregnenolone deficiency, I like to start with 25 to 50 milligrams once a day, working up to most of the time 50 to 100 milligrams, and in some circumstances, all the way up to 200 milligrams. Some people just don't seem to metabolize it very well. If someone is looking to do a trial of low-dose pregnenolone, I tend to recommend starting with 5 to 10 milligrams at the most to see if it's well tolerated before moving into these physiological replenishment doses. Pregnenolone has often been studied in very high doses. It has been studied in doses up to 800 milligrams for arthritis, and a lot of the studies on oral pregnenolone are in very high doses of 400 to 800 milligrams. I don't really recommend this kind of dosing, but I will say that people with intractable pain and chronic injuries can often benefit from higher levels of pregnenolone, but I find this tends to max out at about 200 milligrams for most people. Are there exceptions to the rule? Absolutely. Do exceptions disprove the rule? Absolutely not. So in terms of levels that we're looking to achieve, I'm going to be talking about pregnenolone in nanograms per deciliter. The vast majority of pregnenolone testing all over the world is done in nanograms per deciliter. I have seen some labs do it in different units, but it is simply a matter of moving the decimal place. It's not something like testosterone, which is tested in 5 or 6 different units all over the world. It tends to be in nanograms per deciliter, and if it's not, it's easy to convert by moving the decimal place. The reference range for pregnenolone will vary lab to lab drastically. A common reference range, and I would argue a correct reference range, is 30 to 150 nanograms per deciliter. A lot of the time, it's simply like a less than 150 nanogram per deciliter. I have seen websites such as Life Extension promote that pregnenolone should be optimized to levels of 125 to 175 nanograms per deciliter. I do not disagree with this. However, I have seen many men do fantastically well with pregnenolone levels under 100. In terms of a deficiency, at what level should someone look at potentially doing a trial of pregnenolone? If pregnenolone is under 10, which usually will come back as less than 10, meaning it can't be detected, this is when I would absolutely recommend a physiological trial dose replacement. If someone has levels less than 50 nanograms per deciliter on multiple consecutive blood tests, this can, but does not always indicate that person has a pregnenolone deficiency. So at what number should someone be looking at potentially doing a trial of this hormone? 50 is not a 100%. If it's 51 and above, you're fine. And if it's 49 and below, you've got a problem. But 50 is about the level, give or take, that I find that deficiency symptoms can start to occur. When we're looking at optimizing pregnenolone lab work, and again, it's much more about symptoms than it is about levels because the levels are not particularly accurate, it's important to recognize, are we looking at a 12-hour trough or are we looking at a 24-hour trough? Or if they take it in the morning, are we looking at a 2 to 5 hour peak? This will drastically impact the number that we're looking to optimize for because pregnenolone sulfate, which is the longest acting version of pregnenolone in the body, has a half-life of similar to DHEA sulfate, about 24 hours. So if someone is measuring a 12-hour trough, which is the most common for people who take a single dose before bed, I recommend aiming for a level of about 75 to 150. And if we're looking at a 24-hour trough, I don't mind the levels being a little bit lower on the bloods because it is going to be peaking higher throughout the day. 50 to 100 nanograms per deciliter tends to be the optimal set point for most people, but there are definitely people who fall outside of those ranges. This is simply a ballpark. Symptoms are number one. This is purely giving some loose guideposts so that people can wrap their head around the concept. It's really important, as I said before, that we do not increase progesterone to a supraphysiological level. Most men will start to get anti-androgenic symptoms when their progesterone levels go past about a 5 nanomole per liter if they have optimized testosterone levels. If they don't have optimized testosterone levels, most men do best with a progesterone level between 1 and 3 nanomole per liter in my experience. Now, I have worked with men who do benefit from their progesterone levels going as high as 8, 9, or even 10 nanomole per liter with pregnenolone supplementation. But again, I would argue that these men are exceptions to the rule and do not disprove the rule. So I'd like to go through some myths now. And I've covered these myths since this lecture in my book, Beyond TRT, which you can pick up in the description for $29 Australian. I cover all the most common myths about pregnenolone, DHEA, thyroid, estrogen, fertility, and HCG in that book. But I would like to delve a little bit deeper into them here, as people often have a lot of questions, and that book is a very simplified handbook on these hormones. I highly recommend picking it up if you're looking for something that you can refer back to. So the most common myth that I see surrounding pregnenolone is that pregnenolone is quote unquote shut down by TRT. And if, again, we come back to this steroidogenic cascade here, the idea is that if you create a negative feedback between the testosterone production and the hypothalamus, which is what signals the pituitary to secrete hormones which stimulate the gonads, that because you have done that in the gonads, that you have then done that systemically throughout the body. This is objectively untrue. This is a misunderstanding of very basic science. The literature which supports this misunderstanding of biology is based on the fact that when you use testosterone, the intratesticular levels of pregnenolone, progesterone, and DHEA are drastically reduced because the testicles go offline. You are fulfilling the end result of that gland's function via exogenous supplementation, and therefore not only is less of the precursors required locally in the gonads, but this doesn't extend to the rest of the body's hormonal cascade. It doesn't dysregulate the connection between the hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenals, and thyroid unless you are taking supraphysiological doses of non-bioidentical anabolic steroids. So while pregnenolone is produced in other tissues in the testicles, CYP11A1 is induced by luteinizing hormone. So again, if we come back to this graph, the connection between the cholesterol and the pregnenolone is via CYP11A1. This enzyme is induced, meaning it is stimulated by luteinizing hormone. Luteinizing hormone goes to zero in the testicles and in the brain and systemically in the body when you go on TRT. However, luteinizing hormone is not the only thing that stimulates CYP11A1 production. If this theory was true, everyone, bar the few outliers, would have a pregnenolone deficiency on TRT of all ages, all shapes and sizes, and that also means that everyone would benefit from pregnenolone supplementation and would not receive side effects. This is not how the industry works. Ask any practitioner who is informed with pregnenolone, and they will tell you that not every man on TRT requires pregnenolone supplementation. This is not correct. So the tricky thing here that can complicate people's N=1, meaning their individual interpretation of this information, is that they'll go, oh, well, when I went on TRT, my pregnenolone levels were low. In my experience, this is due to the fact that pregnenolone levels were low to begin with, they just weren't checked. If pregnenolone levels were checked prior to TRT, we would see that there may be a non-significant drop in serum levels that wouldn't really fall outside natural fluctuation anyway. But I have never to date, and I said this 5 years ago, I said this 2 years ago, and I'm going to say it again today, I have never in my entire career seen a TRT-induced pregnenolone deficiency. Never seen it. So it's very important that we look at hormones in balance, because then we also have progesterone and allopregnenolone, which are two metabolites which are positive allosteric modulators of this receptor. Pregnenolone sulfate and DHEA sulfate are both negative allosteric modulators. So together, when these hormones are all optimal, it brings these systems into balance. A lot of the time when we're looking at biohacking or